Hello, Namaste. This is Dr. Aparna. I'm an Ayurvedic neuropsychotherapist. So today we are talking about trauma. So we are discussing the book, The Body Keeps the Score. So brain, mind, and body in the healing of trauma. So how can body impact the brain, the mind, and the body? So, The Body Keeps the Score is a book written by the psychiatrist and a trauma specialist, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. So, the author summarized his 4 decades of experience studying the impact of trauma on the brain, clinical experience, and research into the effects of trauma. So, See, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. So, brain, mind, and body in the healing of trauma. So, this is a landmark book. It has profoundly impacted the understanding and treatment of psychological trauma. So, the body keeps the score. So, what is this? This is the central metaphor which highlights that traumatic memories are not just stored in the brain as cognitive narratives, but are encoded in the body's sensations. So they're encoded in the physiological responses like heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, and alarm systems. So, trauma survivors often relieve the physical and emotional terror of their past without conscious recall of the event. So, what does this mean? So, whenever we experience a real or perceived threat, our brain's alarm system gets triggered. So, this alarm system involves a region of the brain called the amygdala. So whenever we perceive a real or experience a real or perceived threat, so this amygdala comes into action. So which the author refers to as the brain's smoke detector. So, whenever the amygdala senses a threat, for example, a person on the street who looks threatening, you might feel it could be true or it could be perceived that you might feel that the person could threaten you. So, what happens is this recruits the stress hormones and autonomic nervous system to orchestrate a whole body response. So, what do you do? That propels us to run, to hide, to fight, to freeze, to confront the threat. So, you can do one of these. So, in these moments, we might notice a quicker heart rate. This is not only psychological, we will also experience physiological symptoms. So, quicker heart rate, shallow breathing, sweating, and inability to think clearly. So, in this time, simultaneously, what happens are frontal lobes. So, the author refers to them as the watchtower, offer a view of the scene from the above. So, in many cases, they help. The frontal lobes can help us respond to a false alarm and turn off the brain's smoke detector. So the frontal lobes can turn off if it is not a real threat. What happens is, it turns off the brain smoke detector, that is amygdala. So, but in post traumatic stress disorder, we are talking about trauma here. So, what happens is the balance between the amygdala and the frontal lobes shifts radically, so it which makes it much harder for the brain to recognize that the alarm is likely unwarranted. This is not a real threat, this is a perceived threat. So what happens is, as a result, the parts of our brain that are on the lookout for danger are always on alert. So what happens is, once a person experiences a trauma, so the person remembers it you know, it the body, the mind, and the brain remembers it so effectively that even if after that there is a perceived threat, you might feel it is a threat, but it is not a real threat. But still, it makes it much harder for the brain to recognize that the alarm is likely unwarranted. So this is not. So this is what happens in trauma, unlike, to the normal situation. So, what happens is, as a result, the person who has experienced trauma, what happens is the parts of his or her brains that are on the lookout for danger are always on alert. So, even the slightest sign of a threat can trigger the amygdala. So, it's this overactivity that might keep them trapped in a prolonged state of emotional reactivity, so that can take its toll on the body. So in fact, according to the body keeps the score, there are many examples where trauma is connected to physical symptoms. So, if I have to summarize, trauma is not just an event, but an internal response. So, trauma is less about the event itself and more about what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you or what happened to you. So, what happens is different individuals can experience the same event with vastly different internal responses. So, what happens? The exactly the brain on trauma. How does the trauma impact the brain? So the author details it, details how trauma literally reshapes the brain. So we are talking about amygdala overactivity. As I said, the smoke detector of the brain, the amygdala, becomes hyperactive. So constantly scanning for danger, leading to chronic anxiety and hypervigilance. Next is prefrontal cortex underactivity. So, what I said, the watchtower, that is prefrontal cortex of the brain, is usually responsible for rational thought, rational thinking, planning, emotional regulation. So, this becomes suppressed, and making it difficult to think clearly or control impulses. Next is Broca's area. So there is, we all know that the Broca's is the speech center of the brain. So this Broca's, the speech center often goes offline. So this is a code word during traumatic flashbacks, explaining why survivors struggle to put their traumatic experiences into words. So, as I said, trauma is not just an event, it is an internal response. So, this book opens with the author's assertion that trauma is not merely a psychological event. So it leaves a deep imprint on the body, affecting neural pathways, physiological responses, and even genetic expression. So he goes on to say that it also, imprints the genetic expression. So the author argues that conventional approaches often fail because they don't address the fundamental ways trauma reorganizes our internal systems. So the title itself, The Body Keeps the Score, encapsulate the central idea even when the conscious mind tries to forget or suppress traumatic memories, the body retains that experience, manifesting it through physical symptoms like emotional dysregulation, altered perception. So the author integrates insights from neuroscience, developmental psychology, attachment theory, and various therapeutic modalities to offer a holistic approach to healing. So, in this book, see, people, facing, trauma. So this book advocates for a shift from simply managing, symptoms, to understanding and actively processing the body's stored trauma. So bodies stores trauma and ultimately aiming for integration and a renewed sense of self. So facing trauma, traumatized people struggle to regulate their emotions and fail to bond emotionally with others. So trauma affects everyone. So trauma affects the victim and their entourage, so their family, their friends. It also affects the people surrounding that person. So long after the trauma, any minor cues can reactivate the trauma, so inflicting a great deal of suffering once, onto the survivors, who feel like they are damaged to the core. So, while we all want to move beyond trauma, the part of our brain that is devoted to ensuring of our survival is not very good at denial. So, everybody who has experienced trauma want to move beyond trauma, is trying to move beyond trauma. So, but the brain is not ready for it. The brain and the body is not ready for it. So trauma isn't purely, psychological. It produces physiological changes, including a recalibration of the brain's alarm system, an increase in the stress hormone activity, and the alterations in the system that filter relevant from irrelevant information. So in this book, in the next session we are going to learn, the summary of, each chapter, and what is the resolution. The author also gives, resolution, what needs to be done to address trauma, in the right way. So thank you for staying tuned, and namaste.